Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this episode. So, the speaker today is Dr. Muhammad Fawaz Kisti Muhammad Takwir. He's a developmental pediatrics clinical fellow at our CDC at UMMC, and he's going to talk about screening in the community for learning difficulties. So, over to you, Dr. Fawaz.
Hi, thanks, Prof, for the introduction. I hope everyone can see my screen. Good morning to all in attendance this morning. My talk will be on screening for special education needs in the community, and hopefully this will be a relatively light, breezy, and interesting topic for everyone watching. This basically is from my experience participating in this program Saringan Penentuan Murid-Murid Berkeperluan Khas, this MBPK program, which was held earlier this year. It's an outreach screening program held by the Selangor PPD, Pejabat Pendidikan Daerah. And before I talk more into that, I thought it'd be quite pertinent to really give a bit of a background, the history of the education for individuals with special educational needs in our country, to see where we've come from and where we've reached and the current state of affairs. So if we look back post-independence in the 60s to 70s, there was very limited services for children with disabilities, and they really all began as acts of charity, which were primarily initiated by expatriates, often from religious groups. But as early as 1962, the government had already started a special integration education program, which is also known as the PPKI program. But this was really more targeted towards children or individuals with visual impairment. And it was a year later that this program was expanded to include children with hearing impairment as well. So throughout the first 2 decades, from the 60s to the 70s, these services really remained very limited. There was increased access to disability education needs with the emergence of various civil society organizations, such as, the Persatuan Dyslexia. But really, many of the services still remained charity-based and still remained focused primarily on individuals or children with physical disabilities, sensory impairments, as well as those who had very easily identifiable severe intellectual disability. Through to the 80s, we began to see an increased participation and involvement by the Ministry of Education. And this especially followed a 1979 Cabinet Committee report, which informed that the primary provider for education for children with special education needs should be the government. And towards the end of that decade, the Special Education Integration Program, or PPKI, was formally established to include access for children with identified learning disabilities. And the pioneer classes were begun in that year. So moving on to the 1990s, there was an increased consolidation of these special education needs education under the Ministry of the Education, with the establishment of the Special Education Department only in 1995, which was nicely followed by the Education Act of 1996. And this finally provided a formal legal framework governing education in Malaysia, which helped empower the Ministry of Education, as well as other authorities like Jabatan Kebajikan, the Social Welfare Department, to provide education services for children with disabilities. And it was around this time that we finally, had special education schools, also known as Pendidikan Khas, with curriculums that were much more specially geared for children with disabilities. But for our special education schools, it was still predominantly for children with visual and hearing impairments, as well as those with more overt intellectual sort of disability. And it was there to provide education that was more beneficially targeted and helps take the pressures of integration away from these children. Along with that, we also established formally the Special Integration Program, which is also known as PPKI, like I mentioned, where these are specific classes for children with special education needs within the mainstream schools. And then on top of that, there was also the inclusion program or Program Pemulihan Inclusive, which is a remediation program where children with special education needs are afforded the ability to remain in the mainstream classes with some specific classes that are more specially developed for them, such as those for Bahasa Malaysia, Bahasa Inggris, and mathematics. Through to the 2000s, we had an act passed called Person with Disabilities Act. And this act really helped change the paradigm in shifting away the zeitgeist of the stigmatization of children or individuals with special education needs away from a health and wellness issue and more towards looking at how they just have different needs. And it was really this transformation of disability into a social justice issue that helped really improve access to education and helped engender non-discrimination with a gradual increase in accessibility. In the 20-teens, beginning in 2013, the government established this national education policy, which really strived for inclusive education within the mainstream education system. And it's an ongoing thing, and the plan is up to 2025, governing preschool to post-secondary school education, where we are trying to really push forward inclusivity, equal access, improving identification and assessment of children with special education needs, improving provision of individualized education plans, helping with professional development of support staff and teachers, as well as increasing parent and community involvement. But despite this, the current state of affairs isn't too great. In the most recent sort of education and planning reports from 2020, which looked at the years of 2018 to through to 2020, we can see that just looking at primary school education, the number of schools, which is over 7,000 within the whole of Malaysia, we only have about 1,500 schools which are able to provide specialized education needs classes, the PPKI classes. And just over half of the primary schools in Malaysia are able to provide remedial inclusive classes. But it's important to note that these numbers overlap. So often PPKI classes are only available in schools that are already able to provide remedial inclusive education. And if we just look at the numbers of students themselves, in primary school in 2019, we had about 2.7 million primary school students. And we can see that the total number of students with special education needs is only about 60 odd thousand, which, if you think about it, only contributes about 2.2% of the total primary school student population requiring special education needs support. And this includes children with, visual impairment, sensory hearing impairment, intellectual disability, and other diagnoses such as autism, ADHD, in addition to specific learning disabilities like dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. And even if you just look at the worldwide prevalence of just dyslexia alone, studies have given numbers from 5 to 15%. So for us to only have 2.2% of our population with all sorts of special education needs really shows that this demographic is unfortunately still grossly underserved. So there are still a lot of barriers for students to obtain special education needs support, and a lot of it can be boiled down to still societal issues. There's still a general degree of lack of awareness, lack of knowledge, both in the community as well as in the governing bodies. There's still probably unsatisfactory amount of advocacy for these issues. A UNICEF survey, I think about 2 or 3 years back, still identified that almost half the respondents said that children with special education needs are likely to be disruptive, and about a third of the respondents said that children with disabilities should be kept hidden. More than half felt that they still felt very uninformed about disability. So the stigma and discrimination is still very rife. Um, Other societal issues include a lack of sometimes parental involvement, which could be socioeconomically related. There's issues related to problems with provision of logistics and access also to non-governmental funded services. Obviously, there are also language and cultural barriers. A number of children with special education needs may come from families who may not be very proficient with Bahasa Malaysia, which unfortunately is the medium of instruction for a large majority of these special education needs classes. There are also resource limitations, chronic underfunding of schools, a lack of trained professionals, a lack of assistive technology. And also very important, which I'll go into later, is also the access to specialized services, especially when you compare rural areas to more urban regions. And this can show quite a big disparity in resource allocation. There are also very overcrowded classrooms with a high student-to-teacher ratio. So it's very difficult for teachers to provide individualized support. I won't go really into policy and legislation as that's not really my forte, but there have been sort of arguments that the definitions still require better clarity, which has resulted in inconsistent implementation monitoring. And there's still a lot of bureaucratic hurdles because special education, though primarily under the remit of the Ministry of Education, other departments are still involved, including the MOH. But here, I think the crux of the talk today will be on assessments and diagnosis. And we see that accessibility to assessment and diagnosis to identify students with special education needs is still very, very poorly serviced. It's a very, very bureaucratic and lengthy process. And depending on where you go, you might also run into testing and assessment bias. So often children are identified by parents, especially those who can identify problems with learning prior to enrollment in primary school. But there are still quite a large number of students who are only identified once they enroll into formal education, and it can be as late as secondary school. And once these schools have identified students who are struggling with the learning environment, they usually will place them temporarily into an integrated or inclusive remediation program, whilst formal assessments and diagnoses are sought. And the issue is right now that even for Selangor in particular, the Orang Kurang Upaya registration is actually not a mandatory prerequisite for transfer or moving a child into the special education class, the PPKI class. However, typically because of the lack of availability of these classes, most schools still pressure parents into getting formal diagnosis as well as registering in order for them to transition to these classes. So once identified, schools will often refer students to the 3PK center. This is Pusat Perkhidmatan Khas for further assessment. And usually this is when the primary concern for teachers is that the child has a specific learning disability, be that dyslexia, which is the difficulties with written language, dysgraphia, which is difficulties in writing written language, and then dyscalculia, which is numeracy skills. When there are suspicions of something beyond that, or the teachers can identify behavioral problems, social problems, communication problems, suspicious of ASD or autism, sorry, or ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, they'll often get parents to seek a formal assessment through a medical service. Parents also often self-refer to medical services as well as various CSOs, such as Persatuan Dyslexia Malaysia, for assessment. The issue is there's unfortunately a dearth of services for assessment of these children, especially when it comes to behavioral issues, either through the community, child and adolescent mental health services or the developmental pediatricians. In our center, for example, the waiting lists can be up to 20 months for assessment of a new case. And typically the minimum waiting time for a new case is about 15 months. The Pusat Perkhidmatan Khas is able to make some assessments, but it's important to note that the caveat is that even though there are a number of these centers, about 13 across all the states, not all of them are created equal, and not all of them are truly multidisciplinary. For instance, the large one in Putrajaya has services such as audiology services, educational psychologists who can assess and diagnose for specific learning disabilities. They have OTs, whereas in other sort of centers in other states, you might not have all the multidisciplinary services. So often, the process also can take quite a long time for the child to be assessed, and they may often also get referred on because a formal sort of like diagnosis may not be made. So it's a very lengthy, very bureaucratic process that can take a minimum months and usually takes maybe up to a year or so. So it begins with the identification of a child with learning issues to be able to register for the OKU card. The whole assessment and diagnostic process, like I said, can be very long. And once that diagnosis is made, only then can a parent submit the OKU registration to their nearest welfare department. And then the onus is still on the parents to notify their local pejabat pendidikan daerah in order for a child to be appropriately placed into a special education needs class. So because of this, the state of Selangor started looking into this program, Saringan Penentuan Murid Berkeperluan Khas. So this is organized in order to overcome the lack of a true multidisciplinary assessment procedure under the 3PK system. And I was able to attend the one that was held in July this year, which was only the second outreach program. PPD Petaling Utara already has about 4,700 students in their sort of like books. And for this session, they had already identified a further 96 students from various primary schools, as well as public secondary schools. And that also included one vernacular school, which was Mandarin-based medium of education. The students were from primary 3 to form 2 who had already attended at least a year of remediation sort of education under the inclusive program, but still struggled to be moved back into mainstream education. So this was really a multidisciplinary effort. We had primary care medical officers, we had family medicine specialists, OTs, speech and language therapists, educational psychologists, audiologists, nurses. There were also education officers from the PPD. Teachers were in attendance along with the students. And then we had representatives from JKM, Jabatan Anis, which is Anak Istimewa Selangor, as well as from Bank Rakyat. Following registration, the students were assessed in terms of their anthropometric growth measurements in order to identify malnutrition or faltering growth that may impact their physical health and learning at school. They also had visual acuity assessments using the tumbling E-chart, and then proceeded to auditory sort of audiological screening using the otoacoustic emissions as well as pure tone audiometry to identify hearing impairment. They were then assessed by the occupational therapists, assessing gross motor function, as well as fine motor function. So fine motor function included really skills involved with personal organization and assessment of independence of activities of daily living, such as using cutlery, dressing. They also assessed the integration of visual motor skills through drawing shapes, threading lace, coloring pictures. And then handwriting ability was also screened, looking specifically at identifying dysgraphia through looking at writing posture, hand dominance, and the typical features of dyslexia, such as confusion between similar looking letters, upper and lowercase confusion, and such. And then speech and language assessments were undertaken by the SLTs, the therapists, and they use various screening sort of tools, such as the MPLAT, which is the Malay Preschool Language Assessment Tool, really looking at receptive as well as expressive language skills, looking at grammatical understanding, overall vocabulary, um, their narrative skills, their general reading skills, as well as phonological memory, auditory memory as well. And then we were lucky to have two clinical psychologists who did cognitive assessments using the Tony-4, which is a cognitive assessment tool looking at nonverbal intelligence. They also used various screening tools such as the Vanderbilt ADHD scale, as well as the diagnostic statistics manual looking for diagnoses of autism as well as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. They also tested sort of numeracy and reasoning skills. Finally, all of this was compiled by the medical sort of primary medical care practitioners with the support of the specialists in family medicine as well as myself. And we, looked at the pertinent points in the history. We spoke to parents together with the child, with the teachers in attendance to really try to identify the learning issues and to see if there were any pertinent diagnoses that could be reached. And through this, we were able to counsel the parents at a one-stop sort of like a point in order for them to really understand the challenges the child faced in the current school and what sort of learning environment would be more beneficial for them. We spoke with the parents about registration with the Orang Kurang Upaya sort of disability card and what the benefits were, including financial aid. And then if they consented, we were able to fill in the OKU registration at that point. And the parents and the students were then passed over to representatives from JKM so that the registration forms could be filed and submitted then. And they were also able to then speak to the representatives from Anak Istimewa Selangor, looking at other sort of points of aid and services, as well as Bank Rakyat to, help them ease the process of registering their child for a bank account in order to receive financial aid. So all in all, about 94 students were assessed over the course of 4 days. And there were learning disabilities, fulfilling, criteria that were diagnostic for various sort of diagnoses such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, hearing impairment, and visual impairment for a majority of those students. But about 21 did not fill in the OKU registration form, mainly because, maybe the diagnosis was not very obviously clear and further sort of assessments, more detailed assessments were required. And there were still a number of parents who were not keen for OKU registration, who still wanted their children to perhaps remain in the inclusive class for a time until further assessment, with the hope of sort of reintegrating them into general mainstream education. It was all in all a very sort of useful, very eye-opening program that I was very fortunate to participate in. And it really showed to me that there's still a lot of barriers in order for children with special education needs to be identified and for them to obtain parity in terms of access to appropriate education for them. The other take-home message I'd like the attendees to really resonate with is that it's still a very long and difficult hurdle with many logistic and societal sort of barriers in the way for these children to access formal assessments and access formal special needs education. So it really shows that community screening programs do represent a good way in overcoming these barriers. Unfortunately, it's not easy to organize, and it requires interministerial sort of collaboration. Thank you very much for listening. I think that is really about my time, and would like to open this to the floor for any discussions or questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fawaz. It was a very clear overview, and I think it's very systematic. Everyone now has a better idea of what they do with screening. There's one question now the two questions, okay, in the Q&A. So the first attendee, anonymous attendee, asked, children's problems are not treated early. Is there an age limit in rehabilitating them? Would you like to answer that?
There is no age limit. For ideally, the earlier we can intervene, the more sort of intervention, more help we can give. Usually, it equates to better outcomes. But as you can see, we're even identifying children as late as the secondary school years. It was not just in this outreach program, but we also see that in our clinics, where children who are in secondary school are finally sort of identified as having problems with learning because functionally they are unable to adapt to the rising expectations, whereas previously they might not have, and they would still benefit from various forms of intervention, and it could be as simple as helping them with personal organization. It could also be looking into sort of their mental health, which sometimes may not be really spoken about. And obviously, these are things that there is no sort of age limit to.
And there are some questions from Prof. Merritt, so I'm going to combine this. One is whether there's a plan to hold similar sessions at regular intervals, and also what is the stand by the Ministry of Education in providing teaching assistance in mainstream classes for inclusive education.
Okay, so to answer the first question, from my understanding and my discussions during that program, it's something that ideally that the PPDs would like to continue doing. Unfortunately, it's a matter of logistics, a matter of funding, which they couldn't really commit to, but they did express a desire to continue with these programs because it was only the second of the year. And obviously, there's still a large number of students who still require assessments, as we can see from our lengthy waiting list in our clinic. To answer the second question, teaching sort of aids from the Ministry of Education. I mean, if we look at the legal framework, there is this drive for improving the classroom environment for these students. And the aim is to have individualized education plans. And unfortunately, there isn't, it's not egalitarian. There's no parity across the board. Schools, when it comes to location, really vary in terms of what they're able to provide. Previously, from my understanding, teacher aides were allowed, but I think some schools have tried to maybe restrict them because the oversight, from my understanding, is not maybe comprehensive enough, and it makes it difficult for the time being, I think, for there to be this sort of like overarching equality when it comes to having like the teaching aids and various interventions within the classroom itself. I don't know, what is your experience, Prof?
Think the education system has a lot of other things to work out at present. So that's not the main priority, which is a shame, but it is something that needs to be done. So yes, I think IEP is something everyone should have. But can hope for that later. I think there's one more question. We're running out of time, but someone has asked about how other people, like general pediatricians, can be upskilled in order to provide support because sometimes not everyone can get access to developmental pediatric assessments. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what they can do at that level.
Okay, so I think in terms of upskilling, there are various online resources. Obviously, I think that's the easiest way to upskill ourselves. The information is out there, and it's the onus is on like us, I guess, for um, improving in our own knowledge. There are a lot of resources online, and the ones that we tend to show like parents as well will be, various websites such as Raising Children. It's a very good website that, you can sort of like provide, especially to parents. And it's also a good reminder, even for myself as a developmental pediatrics trainee, to look at, where we can sort of like improve in our own personal knowledge, even if you cannot like formally identify or diagnose, you feel that you don't have the necessary sort of experience to diagnose like children with dyslexia or let's say autism. Even being aware of the symptoms already helps because you can still talk to parents about various sort of interventional modalities. You can still refer on to early intervention programs even if you have identified the symptoms or the signs, and irrespective of if you've managed to get like a formal diagnosis. And I think if we can get these children access to early intervention, we would really see, a lot of improvement early on, even before, they even reach the point of entering formal um, primary school education.
All right, thank you, Dr. Fawaz, and thank you to the audience for staying. We'll pass over to the next moderator and next speaker. Thanks.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Assalamualaikum.